Are you ready to rumble? Today we examine a change at your company. The audience for this initiative is huge and everyone's attention is highly focused. In just a moment we'll meet the players in this contest, the change, and the reactions people will have to it.
Hi, I'm Glenn Allen from The Change Response. Sometimes change can feel like a cage fight between what is and what needs to be. In this video, we explain why. Welcome to episode 2 of our introduction to the use of the reaction reflector assessment as a tool for designing, implementing, managing, or coping with workplace change, and ultimately with change itself. In this episode, we give you an overview of the 4 reaction types revealed in our research. We help you understand where these reactions come from and what you can do to manage your reactivity so you can get your best personal benefit from change. When facing change, we spontaneously experience reactions that stem from our immediate perceptions about a change. Our perceptions are driven by a combination of what we see, hear, and experience, and by personality characteristics or attitudes that tend to drive how we interpret those perceptions. Perceptions plus attitudes equal reactions. In our research, we found 4 distinct reactions and 1 perception that strongly influences the way in which we experience those perceptions. The main perceptions that drive the reactions are our perceptions of the complexity of the change and the amount of personal risk we perceive in the change. Let's look at each of these perceptions for a moment, then the reactions that they tend to generate in the middle of change. When there's change, our senses are highly tuned. Imagine yourself in the busy waiting area of an emergency room. You're injured and you're in pain. You feel the hurt. You want to be seen as quickly as possible so your pain can be eased. Your senses are highly tuned. You listen to every announcement. You see every ambulance that pulls up. You look at the faces of the medical personnel who pass by for some indication of how busy they are, for how long it might take before they'll look in your direction. You feel the cool air as it wafts over the once warmed sheet that was placed over you when you first came in. Now it's cool to the touch. You're hungry because you've been there for a long time without being seen, and a nurse offers you a snack. Your taste is finely attuned now as well because you wonder what the food will be like if you had to stay for a prolonged period. You taste the snack and are taken aback by how bland it is. Everything is information. Information you hope will give you answers about when your pain will be addressed and what the near-term future will have in store for you. It's like this during change. Every pronouncement, every change in leadership, every meeting you can see happening behind a closed door, all of it is perceived and all of it becomes information about the change. And when things change, our perceptions don't always comfort us. We are on guard for information, good or bad. We call this the lion in the grass time. The genetics behind our brains formed when, as a species, we looked like this guy. Our senses are finely attuned to notice patterns and particularly deviations from or changes to those patterns, like, for example, when our ancestors noticed the pattern of waving grass interrupted by the figure of something dangerous to them, the lion. What do our hunter-gatherer brains tell us to do when we notice that pattern? If we think we can defeat the lion, we fight. If we think we can't, we run. In our modern society at work, fighting or running away aren't generally acceptable options, but our brain and body are still feeling the strain, the stress when faced with perceptions suggesting danger, even danger that is exclusively social in nature. When we talk about the lion in the grass, we at the change response say, "There is no lion." Although you or others might feel stressed by the change, that stress is coming from an ancient reaction system built into our brains and bodies and passed along to us from our distant ancestors. Those ancient ancestors who did not have the fight or flight reaction, for example, didn't survive to procreate, to make the generations that led to you and me. So in a way, we are all the children of fear. Fear driven by our keen senses and perceptions and our somewhat less developed ability to dole out fear only when it's necessary to do so. In today's video, we're going to talk about the two main categories of perceptions we seem to have about change, the four types of reactions these perceptions instigate automatically within us, and what we call the potent motivator. Our awareness of and the strength of the potent motivator determines which of the four reactions are most likely to become the way we respond to change. A reaction is a feeling or a state of mind. A response is our behavior. The potent motivator plays a large part in determining whether we will commit wholeheartedly to the change or not. There's a process behind how we ultimately respond to change, and the process goes like this. Perceptions produce reactions, which lead to what we do, the way we respond. Perceptions produce reactions that lead to responses. The combination of the two categories of perceptions, complexity and risk, produce the most likely types of reactions we will have to a change. Think of it like a simple equation. Reaction 1 plus reaction 2 equals response. If you're aware of the potent motivator will determine the strength of your reaction and the direction toward or away from the change that you're likely to take. So we can modify the equation a bit like this. Reaction 1 plus reaction 2 times the potent motivator equals response toward or away from. The presence and the strength of the potent motivator leads people toward change, while the absence of it is more likely to lead people away from change. When we're not aware of the potent motivator, we're on autopilot, driven by our reactions to change. In today's video, we'll show you what you can do to become more aware of the potent motivator. All of what we'll discuss today is driven by our research into the response to change. Let's start by looking at the two categories of perception. When we perceive change, the two main categories of perceptions we found in our research are 1, the complexity of the change, and 2, the amount of risk we perceive in the change. To illustrate the simplicity of our model, let's look at a few people who seem to be demonstrating reactions to something, let's call it change, based on these perceptions. And let's see if you think they'd be likely to implement the changes they might be reacting to. Now, in some cases, the reactions look literal, whereas in others, they're more like allusions to states of mind. The exercise will make more sense once we get started. See if you agree or disagree with our suggested answers. Is this person likely to implement the change they are contemplating? Is this person likely to implement the change they are contemplating? Is this person likely to implement the change they are contemplating? Real life isn't as simple as these video exercises. Other factors help determine our ultimate response to change. How do you think someone might react to an organization's change if they found it to be complex? This is a little tricky. As we saw in the video clips, they might look or be confused. But confusion is more of a state of mind than a reaction. How would you react to a change in your organization if you found it was a little complex? For most of us, the answer would probably be, it depends. A reaction that points in the direction of becoming committed to the change would be to study the change, to learn more about it. A reaction that points away from the direction of commitment is to avoid it by feeling not only confused, but also frustrated by that confusion. Imagine a change that is fairly complex. How likely would you be to study the change, to actively work to learn more about it if you thought it would be beneficial to the organization? How likely would you be to study the change if you thought it would be good for your job? How likely would you be to study the change if you thought it would improve your personal life or career success in some way? Are you more likely to study a complex if you thought it would be good for the organization, good for your job, or good for you personally? Hold your answers in mind or jot them down while we look at risk. Two reactions related to perceived risk are approach and avoidance. Experimentation with a change, trying out pieces of it, is an approach reaction. Putting one's head down and hoping the change will pass by is an avoidance reaction. How would you react to change in your organization if you perceived some personal risk for yourself in it? As with before, it probably depends. How likely would you be to test or experiment with the change if you felt it was personally risky to do so, but it was good for the organization? How likely would you be to test or experiment with the change if you felt it would make your job easier or less complicated? How likely would you be to test or experiment with the change if you believed that doing so would improve your personal life, your career, or enhance your ability to get a promotion or a raise? Are you more likely to approach a risky change if it's good for the organization, good for your job, or good for your personal life? Jot down your answers. If you're like most people in our research study, which was 269 people from across various organizations and industries, you're more likely to move toward the approach side of the equation the more you perceive the change as being good for you personally. This is true for changes perceived as complex and those perceived as being risky to you personally. If you perceive personal benefit in the change, you're probably more likely to study it and to test it out for yourself than you would be if you didn't perceive any personal benefit in it, even if it was good for your organization or for your job. The potent motivator. What if you perceive a change as being both very complex and very risky to you personally? Are you more likely to approach it or to avoid it? If you're like most people, you might immediately react with the answer, well, I'd avoid a change that was confusing and risky to me personally. This is where what we've been calling the potent motivator comes in. Perceived personal benefit is the potent motivator. The third choice in the questions you were asked a few minutes ago about whether you'd approach complex change or a risky change was always the option with perceived personal benefit. While benefit to the job, something that makes your job easier, more efficient, or a greater contribution to the whole, is always a motivator, the most potent motivator of all is perceived personal benefit, something that makes your life itself better, something that gives you more time, more satisfaction, more money, greater opportunity, a better career trajectory, a better balance between work and life. Why do we call perceived personal benefit the potent motivator? Let's go back to the change you perceive as being very complex and very risky to you personally. The obvious answer is that we'd avoid such a change because it would take a lot of effort and energy to understand, and further, because if we implement it, we perceive a risk to ourselves personally, like to the quality of our life or to our enjoyment of our work. Avoidance in this case, in the form of fight or flight, being in obvious opposition to the change, giving up on the job, or quitting and looking for a new job, is the most natural reaction to a complex and personally risky change. We found something fascinating in our statistical analyses of the data, however. Let's say someone rated their perception of a change as being of the highest complexity, a 10 on a 10-point scale, and of the greatest personal risk to them, again, a 10 on a 10-point scale. Then we would say their natural fight-flight reaction would probably be at a 10 on a 10-point scale, and the person would either quit the job, quit on the job by no longer feeling attached or committed to the organization, or actively work against the change, a level of 10. What was fascinating was that perceived personal benefit at a rating of 5 was enough to reduce the fight-flight response by at least 50%, right out of the avoid reaction and over the line into the approach side of the equation, halfway closer to developing an intent to implement the change. What does this mean in practical terms? It means that when we perceive personal benefit in a change, this perception, no matter how slight, is often enough to get us to engage with a change, to experiment with elements of it, to test to see if that perception of personal benefit will be real. Our finding may be consistent with the well-known prospect theory of Kahneman and Tversky, which suggests that people will do more to avoid a likely loss than to secure a possible gain. It's as if the mere possibility of a personal benefit is enough to get people to engage with the change that their reactions might be pushing them to avoid. Working harder to avoid the loss of a possible personal gain in the case of change means engaging with those aspects of it we think might bring us personal benefit. And that perception of personal benefit is enough to cut in half the negative impact of perceived personal risk on intent to implement, if perceptions of that personal benefit can get through our reactivity. If you perceive personal risk in a complex change, the question has to be, how do you get yourself to a state of mind where you're not stuck in fight-flight mode so you can perceive some personal benefit, that potent motivator of engagement in the change, and experiment with, test, or try out certain elements of it? We're going to cover this in greater detail in a subsequent video, but I'll drop a hint here. Mindfulness is the key. It takes mindfulness to secure for ourselves a moment within which we can choose to act toward our personal benefit instead of reacting in our fight-flight mode. Mindfulness is always about making room for choice. It's about using our minds in a way that tethers us to the here and now, freeing us from our reactions and enabling a choice about how we want to respond. Earlier, we discussed the two main perceptions of change, perceived complexity and perceived risk. And we said that perceived personal benefit changes the way these perceptions combine to form reactions to change. Let's take a look at the perceptions of complexity and risk and see how the amount of perceived personal benefit impacts the initial reaction to change. For the perception of complexity, the level of perceived personal benefit determines the extent to which the person at work is likely to study the change. With a high perceived benefit, the person is likely to respond by studying the change. With a low perceived personal benefit, the desire to study the change will be lower. With a high amount of perceived personal benefit, a person at work who perceives risk in a change is likely to dip a toe in the water to test the change, trying it out to see if it might actually provide the personal benefit they perceive. With a low amount of perceived personal benefit, their reaction is more likely to be fight, flight, or avoid. With a low level of perceived personal benefit, a person who also reports a low level of intent to implement might either ignore the change or participate at least half-heartedly. A person with a high degree of perceived personal benefit and a high reported intent to implement is likely to implement, and a high reported perception of risk might not be enough to outweigh the high perceived personal benefit that propels them toward the change. It's as if perceived personal benefit halts our initial reaction to change and causes us to think, to be more mindful of how we'd like to actually respond. So the very perception of personal benefit is a form of mindfulness. When we're stuck in our initial reaction to change, mindfulness can also help us pause, sometimes just long enough to perceive some personal benefit. The relationship between mindfulness and perceived personal benefit is a virtuous cycle, a loop of positivity that can bring us both choice and reward in the midst of even the most chaotic change. The 4 named reactions. So here are the 4 proper names we use to describe the combinations of perceptions about a change, as moderated by the potent motivator of perceived personal benefit. The 4 reactions to change we've discussed are study, test, fight, flight, and implement. Remember, however, that reactions are merely automatic emotional states brought about by our perceptions as we vigilantly observe change. Because we're programmed to notice everything when change is about, our perceptions are keen, but our perceptions are not always accurate. Sometimes we missee, mishear, or misunderstand what we perceive. We act as if there's a lion in the grass, and we might think a change is more confusing, riskier, or less personally beneficial than we might think in a different state of mind. Ideally, when we experience change, we can be prepared to perceive accurately, prepared to be open to the personal benefit a change might ultimately provide us in terms of new opportunities, new growth, new learning, new skills, and the chance to show our resiliency, agility, and creativity. Essentially, what we're talking about here is our ability to be prepared to take a pause between our reaction and our ultimate response. A pause we can use to search for our personal benefit and to engage with the change. This ability to pause mindfully in the midst of change is the subject of our next video. And is this ever an important topic for today? We hope you enjoyed this deeper dive into the reaction reflector. Today we helped you better understand what is, your reactions to change. In the next video, we'll help you learn more about what can be, a way to use techniques to be mindful in the midst of change, mindful enough to choose your response instead of being controlled by your reaction. We'll also drop some hints for those who implement change, hints about how mindfulness can be your very best change agent. I'm Glenn Allen from The Change Response, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. In the meantime, if you like what you heard today, or if you like what you're hearing, please click the like button. Also, please subscribe so you can be notified of when our next video drops. Thanks.